Well, we're already at Chapter 7, Communicating Effectively. There's basically three things that we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the basic aspects of interpersonal communication. We're going to explain the keys to effective verbal interpersonal communication. And we're going to describe the elements of nonverbal interpersonal communication, which would be body language. So let's go ahead and get started. Some basic definitions. A message is information being delivered from the sender to the receiver. There's basically two things going on. There's encoding, which is the act of producing the message. So the talker, the person speaking, is encoding the message. And then there's decoding, which is the act of understanding. Either of these two things can get messed up. So the person producing the message can have one thing in their mind. They're trying to produce a message, but perhaps they're not encoding it properly. They're not saying really what they want to say. And then the decoding, the person's trying to understand the message, but perhaps they're not understanding quite what the person's saying. And that's actually referring to noise. So noise, when we're talking about communication, doesn't mean like just regular noise in the environment. It can be environmental, physiological, psychological factors, anything that would decrease the likelihood that a message will be accurately encoded or decoded. So a person's excess baggage, anything going on, let's say you're in a really bad mood and you just don't hear what somebody's saying in the way that they mean it, we would call that noise. Interpersonal communication is an ongoing transactional process that involves at least two individuals, each of whom is acting as the sender and the receiver. In other words, it is talking. Two people, they're encoding, decoding, they're having a conversation. It sounds simple enough, but let me show you a diagram of what could be going on. So we have person A and person B. We have the context of what's going on. We have the environment. We have noise. We have physiological. We have psychological. So the person could have physiological reasons that they're not hearing so well. They could have psychological reasons that they're interpreting things differently. It could be within the context. So let's say it's a personal relationship, or it could be a work relationship. It could be that the person's had a bad day. I mean, all these things going on. So we're encoding, we're decoding, and then here is the message. So you can see with all this stuff going on, I mean, it's really no wonder that messages, well, to be frank, they get screwed up. And we will talk about that now. So what we want to do is communicate effectively. To do that, you need to consider the background, the needs, and the abilities of your listener. You need to think about who am I speaking with, and what are their needs? What do they want me to be talking about? For example, in these PowerPoints, basically your needs are to pass this class to get the information. Therefore, my goal is to cover all the information, or as much as I can, that will be on the quiz. Simple as that. These would not be at all helpful if, for example, I was to spend the next half an hour talking about what I'm going to do this weekend. It might, well, it probably wouldn't be more interesting, but that would not be effective communication. The most effective thing I can do is think about the needs of my listeners, think about what the goal is, and then to present that. We also have to consider denotation and connotation. Denotation is the objective meaning of words. So I have here, when are you going to clean the house? The denotation is, when are you going to clean the house? The person is just asking, when are you going to clean the house? The connotation is a subjective meaning of the word. So when are you going to clean the house could subjectively mean, this house is a pigsty. When are you going to get up off your butt and clean it? So a lot of times a question or a statement, the words in and of themselves have a denotation, but the connotation can mean something completely different. And the person who's speaking the words may or may not mean what that connotation is. And when I was doing marital therapy, I mean, that's where a lot of arguments would start. So the person would say something, you know, when are you going to clean the house? And the other person would interpret that to mean something completely different. The most effective messages are spoken in simple, concrete terms. They're spoken very specifically. Good speakers have verbal and nonverbal messages that are consistent. In other words, if I am really excited about something, my body language also conveys that this is something positive. I'm excited about it. If you've ever been in a lecture with a professor and they're droning on and on and on, but they're trying to convince you that this is really important information, it doesn't work. If their body language and their tone suggests that it's boring, no matter how wonderful they say it is, it becomes very boring. So good speakers have verbal and nonverbal messages that are consistent. Listening skills are also very important. There's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is the physiological process. That's when your eardrum reverberates, you hear. Listening is the psychological process. That's when you interpret and understand what someone says. So you can hear what somebody says without really listening. If you're listening, you heard it, and you also understood it, and you interpreted it, and you were invested enough to actually pay attention to what they were saying. People like talking to someone who is a good listener. So here's some strategies to become a better listener. Obviously, don't hog the conversation. Nobody likes a conversation hog. Pay careful attention to the person talking. Use reflective listening and paraphrasing. You don't want to sound like, a psychologist and parrot back everything they say. But certainly using some reflective listening. And what that is the person says something and then you rephrase a little bit of it just to show that you're listening to what they said and you understood what they said. Synthesize themes and patterns that you hear. So if they're talking about a bunch of different things, they're just mentioning all these horrible things that happened to them during the day, just to say, wow, you really had a crappy day. What that is you're taking all the different themes and you're putting them together and you're saying, wow, what a bad day. I mean, it sounds like common sense, but that shows that you were paying attention. And then giving feedback in a competent manner. When somebody tells you something, they're expecting you to give some sort of feedback. I mean, have you ever told somebody something and then you finish and you look at them and they're just staring at you? I mean, that feels really awkward. So you want some sort of feedback, and as the listener, that's sort of your job. So the person finishes, and then your job is to give some sort of feedback, whether that's to empathize with them or to, just to say, wow, or, I'm really sorry that happened, or wow, that's really cool, but to give some sort of feedback when they're done. Self-disclosure is a way of building relationships. It's the communication of intimate details about ourselves. So when you start a relationship, you start introducing more personal things about yourself. So I have one here, an example. I find men wearing sheepskin to be very sexy. Okay, that would be absolutely ridiculous to say to somebody, well, ever, but it would be ridiculous to say to somebody when you first met them. And the point I'm trying to make is when people disclose things that are personal too early in a relationship, it sounds odd, it makes us uncomfortable, and it throws up flags. And for a lot of people, we turn and run away. We don't want to be friends with them, or we don't want to be in a relationship with them. So I'm cautioning you to use self-disclosure carefully. On one hand, you need to self-disclose to build the relationship, because if you don't disclose anything, it's really difficult to build the relationship and to, become, more intimate with the person, whether that be a friendship or, a romantic relationship. But on the other hand, if you start the relationship and then you kind of spill your guts on everything that's happened to you all through your life, too early, it's not appropriate. Here, I actually have a slide saying that. So self-disclosure can deepen relationships. It requires some risk because it does leave you vulnerable. It does require that we trust the listener. But again, I would use it with caution. There's a time and place for everything. And disclosing really personal information, just think before you say it. Okay, let's go into conflict and assertiveness. People deal with conflict in one of 4 basic ways. They can become aggressive, manipulative, passive, or assertive. Assertive is the one we want. So aggressive is and these are patterns, okay? So the person becomes often angry, insensitive to the other person's feelings. Manipulative, they can make others feel sorry or guilty. They can take on the martyr role. Passive, the person's submissive, they're not assertive, they don't express themselves. Or assertive, the person acts for their own best interest by standing up for legitimate rights and expressing their views. So being between assertive and aggressive, assertive, they're standing up for legitimate rights and expressing their views. Aggressive, the person is angry and they're just going over the top. They're being insensitive to others' feelings. Being assertive can be difficult for some people, especially if you grew up in a household where, especially for women, if you grew up in a household where you weren't taught to be assertive, you were taught to be submissive. So first thing, evaluate your rights. Do you have a right to whatever? Let's say you're asking for a raise. Do you have a right to the raise? Evaluate that. Then designate a time for discussing what you want. So you would go to your boss and designate a time. State the problem in terms of how it might affect you. So you would come up with all the data. Describe the problem objectively. Express your feelings about the situation. So if I was talking to my boss, I wouldn't necessarily get into my feelings. You might do that with a more personal situation. And then number 6, crucial step, ask for what you want. If you do not ask for what you want, chances are you're not going to get it. And when I was doing marital counseling, that's the most important thing. Couples would argue about things and I would ask them, well, did you ask for that? Did you ask to spend more time? Did you ask for them to accompany you to this? And most often they would say no. And I'd say, well, your husband or your wife is not a mind reader. They have no way of knowing if you did not ask. And asking does not count if you ask during an argument and you were shouting. That doesn't count. It has to be during a time when it's a neutral time and you just ask for something. Speaking of relationships, there are differences in genders and verbal communication. Women tend to be less assertive. Men tend to be more aggressive. I'm speaking in generalities. Women, they do more rapport talk. So the conversation is aimed at establishing connections and negotiating connections and relationships. So women do not necessarily want to come to a conclusion or get the solution to a problem. For women, it's more about feeling better about the problem or establishing that relationship. For men, it's more report talk. So the talk is designed to provide information and come to a conclusion or a solution. And when you put those two types together, you can come across some problems. So if you're listening to a woman on the phone, she will tell a story and she'll tell it over and over and over and over. And the other woman, they'll repeat themselves. And they're both very comfortable with that. And they're rapport talking. With a man, and again, I'm stereotyping, I understand that. It's more, you tell the story, you do it once, the other guy says, okay, here's the solution, boom, they're done. Women have a hard time with that because they don't necessarily want to be told what to do. They want somebody to empathize with them and to understand and to be there. They don't necessarily need a solution thrown at them or something fixed. They want that rapport talk. And men do not really, and again, I'm generalizing, I know, but they don't really want that over and over and over again telling the story. They just want this to be fixed. A few more differences that we've seen in the studies. Women tend to rely more on self-disclosure, so women tend to talk more about personal things. Men tend to interrupt conversations more, which leads us right into barriers of effective verbal communication. So barriers to effective communication are things that would get in the way of communicating. First thing would be judging. So any form of judging, which could be criticizing, name-calling, labeling, these get in the way of communicating. And if your goal is to effectively communicate something, as soon as the judging takes place, the criticizing, the name-calling, you are no longer effectively communicating. Another barrier is proposing solutions. And I know this may seem counterintuitive because proposing solutions sounds like, great, well, that seems like I'm communicating. But as soon as you start giving advice or questioning, ordering, well, of course, threatening or moralizing, those make sense. But when you're giving advice or questioning somebody, really what you're saying is, I know better than you, and I'm going to tell you what to do. And that's not really communicating. Other barriers can take the form of diverting, which would be somebody starts to talk about something and then you just take a U-turn and start talking about something else. One-upping. So your spouse comes home and they say they had a horrible day at work, and as soon as they say that, you start talking about how horrible your day was instead of acknowledging what they said. Even if it's true, even if your day was worse, it's not helpful to one-up. And then also giving logical arguments. Sometimes it's not worth being right. It's more important to empathize and to be there for the other person. So, some strategies for effective communication. You want to make your messages direct. You want to deliver your messages immediately. Do not bottle them up. Make your messages clear. If you sense that the person didn't understand what you were saying, if you sense that there was some miscommunication, then try again. Try to make them very clear. Deliver a straight message, and make your message supportive. So I mentioned this earlier. We have nonverbal communication, and this is your body language. Messages that are transmitted from one person to another in means other than linguistic. So your body language. And this can include body communication such as gestures, facial expression, touch, spatial communication, which we'll talk about, paralanguage, which is your voice, how fast you're talking, the tone of your voice, how loud your voice is. So we'll get to all of these momentarily. So can you tell if somebody's lying? Well, I'll tell you a few things about liars. Liars tend to blink more, and they have dilated pupils. They tend to self-manipulate more, so they fix their tie, they fix their hair, they fiddle with their hands. They tend to give shorter, negative, generalized responses. They speak in distancing ways, so they don't make things very personal. Their voice takes a slightly higher pitch. And they take more time to plan what they're going to say, so there's not that immediate response. They need to think about their answers. Just about everyone says that they're pretty good at picking out liars. The truth of the matter is, we're not good. They do study after study after study, and people we're not good at it. So, you know, I think I'm pretty good at catching my kids, but in general, like at the workplace or out in society, we're really not that good. So I would caution you, because if we're not that good, that means that we're capable of being fooled by people. So some body language. Eye communication, very important in the United States. From little on up, we're taught to look them in the eye. Watching somebody's face is important. We can monitor feedback. We can monitor their mood. It can signal a turn in the conversation, signal the nature of the relationship. It can compensate for physical distance. So if you're across the room, but you're making eye contact with somebody, you can still... Americans are good at this. We can still hold a conversation across the room and kind of shout at the person, but as long as you're making eye contact, you're indicating that I'm talking to you. If you start looking away and losing that eye contact, that can indicate, okay, I'm done talking to you. So eye communication is very important, here in the States. In other countries, there are countries that, it's considered rude, and there's people that are very uncomfortable with how much eye communication and how much eye contact that Americans have. So it's cultural as far as how much is okay. Touch is another thing that's cultural. Touch plays an important role in nonverbal communication. Be careful with it. Nowadays, I would caution you to not touch anybody in the workplace. It can be misunderstood. I just would caution you not to. I'll just leave it at that. But with your friends, touch can certainly express, if you're consoling somebody, if you're joking around and you just kind of gently touch them. There's lots of things that we can do. There's different groups of people that are more comfortable. If you've ever been around somebody that's really touchy-feely, they're just constantly touch, 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 and you're not touchy-feely, it can be really uncomfortable. There are some people that are just really comfortable with hugging everybody and just being, real up in their face. And it really depends on how comfortable each person is with it. And I would just caution you, if you're one of those people, be very careful with who you do that with, because I'll tell you, 20 years ago, no problem. Nowadays, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but nowadays it's a very hot topic and it's a very sensitive topic, especially when you're in the workplace. Proxemics is the study of communication, the communicative function of space. In other words, how close you stand to somebody when you're talking to them. And if you've ever been with somebody who is a close talker, you become very aware of how space plays a difference. So they've just identified 4 zones in which we interact. And if you think about this, it really makes sense, because we have an intimate zone. So people that you're intimate with, you stand really close to. A personal distance, a social distance, and then a public distance. So if somebody that you've just met gets into your intimate distance, it feels very uncomfortable. One of the things that's always interesting to me is when couples used to come in and they'd sit down on the couch, for couples therapy, you could always tell how they were getting along, because if they sat like really far away, like the social distance versus the intimate distance or the personal distance. But there are differences in how close we stand, and that's also cultural. So if you've ever been around people from a different culture and they had different distances and they were talking to you and they're much closer than we like, it can feel pretty odd. And there's a couple episodes. I know there was a Seinfeld episode, there was a Friends episode where we talk about the close talkers. So it's kind of pop culture has also picked up on the idea. So being silent. Well, being silent is a good idea. And if you're a good listener, to be a good listener, I would encourage you to be quiet sometimes. There's lots of ways to show a person that you're listening other than talking. So when somebody's talking, you can kind of lean forward, use your eye contact, keep your face in an expression that shows I'm listening. You observe the other person's gestures. And actually, we tend to mimic what the other person's doing. So if the other person, has their arms crossed, we tend to follow those same gestures and pay attention to it. You'll see people doing it. We tend to mirror what they're doing. But there's a lot of things that we can do and be quiet that will show somebody that we're listening to them. And the speaker, it makes them feel as if what they're saying is important. And that's what we want to do. We want the person who's speaking to feel as if what they're saying is important. We're listening to you. And then there's paralanguage, which includes aspects such as how fast you're talking, the volume, and the pitch. So it's not just what you're saying, but it's how fast you're saying it, the volume, whether you're shouting it or saying it, really quietly, and also the pitch. So if you're fussing it or if you're saying it normally. So, all these things go into communication. So if I say, when is dinner? If I shout it, it has a whole new meaning. If I say, when is dinner? It has a different meaning. We can say it in so many different ways that the words are the exact same, but the meaning becomes completely different. So what I'd like you to do is, from now on, pay attention to the communication. Think about what dimensions of nonverbal communication are important. Think about how your body language plays a role in communication. Do you notice this spatial communication? Do you notice when people are too close to you? Do you notice the different zones? Try being quiet and listening to somebody talk. Try giving some feedback when somebody's done talking. Try some of these techniques. So I think it's an excellent chapter. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do, and please let me know if you have any questions.